So welcome to our first lecture in this biology series. What I want to mention first is that all of those slides, if you have difficulties seeing any details on these slides, will be on your Canvas page, and you can pull them up on your computer and you can read all of the details at higher magnification. So today what we want to talk about is disciplines in biology, how is scientific research conducted, timeline of life on Earth, and criteria for life. Let's start with biological disciplines. So if you look at the broad picture of biology, there are a number of different areas within biologists' work. Some work at the molecular, cellular level, so you work with atoms, molecules, organelles, or cells. So these are the smallest building blocks, the smallest structures out of which life is formed. Then there are scientists who work at the tissue level, at the organ level, organ system level, or the animal level, the entire organism level. So this is more the organismal level. This here would be more the cellular level, organismal level. And then there are scientists who work at the populational level, and they work with populations, species that they are concerned with in communities, ecosystems, or biospheres. And what I often hear is when people want to go more into the ecology, that they say, well, I'm really not so interested in the cell biology or the molecular biology. This is really not something that is relevant for me. But it actually is very relevant for, as much as this is relevant for the cellular molecular level, the cellular molecular level is also relevant for the populational level, because, I give you an example, if you work with a certain species and you want to understand how this species reproduces, the reason why species reproduce is found at the cellular molecular level, and for that reason it is critically important to know a little bit about all of this in order to be able to understand and investigate all these different aspects that scientists are researching. There are many different categories within which, or fields within which biologists work. Molecular biology, biochemistry, cell biology, so this is all at the cellular molecular level here. Then more at the tissue, organ level, where it would be neurobiology, physiology, anatomy. And as you can see here, all of these subfields here can be further subdivided into other fields of expertise. And the more we learn, the more it becomes apparent how complicated nature really is. And nowadays, many scientists really need to work with collaborators. Even if you are a neurobiologist, you often need to team up with others who are experts in other fields, because our knowledge has become so monumental that it's just impossible for just one scientist to know it all. So for that reason, we team up, we agree to collaborations and work together. So what is science? Science is the Latin word for knowledge, and there are different fields of science. There's computer science, so this is knowledge about computers. There is the natural sciences, that is sciences about nature, that includes geology, that includes physics, chemistry. And then the biological sciences, and these are the sciences that are concerned with the living organisms, so that's usually biological sciences. How do scientists work, and how do scientists conduct their experiments? So as a scientist, you make an observation. And this observation yields a question, and I give you an example for this. Now in the springtime, we hear all of those peeper frogs peeping out there. And this is because the females are producing the eggs now and starting to reproduce. And those little fertilized eggs develop into tadpoles. So if you observe those frogs, you can ask yourself this question: why do those females now start to lay their eggs in the spring? Why didn't they lay them in the winter? And why don't they lay them in the summer? And why don't they lay them in the fall? So you can postulate a few hypotheses. So what can I come up with? One hypothesis is, well, they produce the eggs in the spring because the males start to peep, and this peeping of the males, or this calling of the males, triggers a hormonal signal in those females that makes them produce eggs. This would be my first hypothesis. My second hypothesis, what I can possibly think about, so these are these hypotheses that we postulate regarding your question. Well, the light cycle changes. The winter time, the light is fairly sparse and the days are very short. Now comes spring. Now our daylight is longer, so that might trigger that the females lay their eggs. That's my second hypothesis. My third hypothesis, okay, another parameter that changes is the temperature. So maybe it's a temperature that triggers the egg development within these frogs. So what I can now do is I can make an experiment. I can put my frog in a box, and I can in the winter time, and I can expose it to peeping sounds and see, is my first hypothesis correct? Does my frog now produce eggs? And well, no, my frog didn't produce eggs. So in other words, I can reject this hypothesis. The peeping sound of the male frogs doesn't seem to do it. So I test my second hypothesis, and my second hypothesis is that it is the light cycle. So I put my frog in a box in the winter time, and I expose it to longer light cycles. I leave all the other parameters the same, and still my frog doesn't produce any eggs. So I can reject this hypothesis as well. Now I take my third hypothesis and I test it. Is it the temperature? So I take my frog in the winter time, I put it into my box, and I expose it to warmer temperatures. And yes, now my frog starts to develop eggs. So now this hypothesis is a little bit more interesting to me. So now I have to postulate other experiments. I have to make my predictions. So if I have 3 frogs in boxes and I alter the temperature in these boxes, set 1 to -2 degrees Celsius, 1 to 5 degrees Celsius, and 1 to 10 degrees Celsius, then my prediction would be that the one at -2 does not produce eggs, and so on and so forth. So these are now my experiments that I make, and I can then verify my hypothesis. What is important with this, as you do this, is that you are able to document your experiments, and that other scientists are able to reproduce those experiments. This is basically how science works, how scientific experiments are conducted. And when we have our lab component, we will do a few experiments in the lab. So now let's talk a little bit about life. What is life? When did it start? What are the characteristics of living organisms? And what are the basic requirements of life? So what is life and when did it start? So living organisms are organisms that respond to a number of criteria, and we'll go through those criteria shortly. Let's look into the timeline here. When did life start? It started with the Big Bang, according to the Big Bang theory, that created our universe about 12 to 14 billion years ago. Then about 4.5 billion years ago, our planet Earth was formed the way we know it today. Not the well, obviously it has been populated with life now, but planet Earth has formed. Then life has first been recorded an estimated 3.5 billion years ago, and these were the single-celled organisms, bacteria. 230 million years ago is when the dinosaurs appeared on the surface of the Earth, and they were extinct 65 million years ago. So they've roamed the Earth for quite a while. And then about 200,000 years ago is when Homo sapiens was first recorded due to fossils on this planet. And just to put everything in perspective, the average lifetime of a human is about 80 years. So you can see we are barely, from timeline, we just appeared on planet Earth, if you look at the broad timeline of the existence of this planet. What is life and how is life defined? And you will find a lot of different discussions going on in this regard, because there are a number of different definitions what is life. And we will have one discussion on our discussion board with regard to life, and in particular with regard to viruses. Do we think that viruses are life? And I would like to discuss this with you. So one of the definitions with regarding to life, and you will find this in many biology textbooks, consists out of these 7 points, and let's go through those 7 points. The first one is structure based on cells. So all living organisms consist of cells. So that's the single smallest unit in an organism. And they are single-celled organisms like protozoa or phytoplankton. And these are single-celled organisms that can either live in water or can live on land, or bacteria, prokaryotic organisms are also single-celled organisms. And these are organisms that just consist out of one cell and basically can perform every function of these organisms within this one single cell. Multicellular organisms consist of a multitude of cells, trillions of cells, and they're animal cells, they're plant cells, and they're very specialized cells, as you know this from our organism, like our muscle cells that are specialized for contraction. And then there are our neurons, particularly our motor neurons, who have these very long axonal extensions that contact this muscle fiber, release acetylcholine, this neurotransmitter acetylcholine, onto the muscle fiber and make our muscle fibers contract. So they look very different from those ordinary cells, from other cells like epithelial cells, and we will learn more about those cells throughout this course. But they all have the basic building blocks that characterize cells. So the structure based on cells is one definition and one criterion for life. Anything that doesn't have cells but moves is not defined as life, according to this criteria. The second one is an ordered complexity. So if you look at these cells, there are all these different organelles, and we will learn a lot about those organelles throughout this lecture series. And these organelles work with each other, and then making the cell within this organism function properly. And this complexity, this ordered complexity, is another criterion for life. If you just put some organelles into the compartment that is surrounded by a membrane, that is not defined as life. Then sensitivity to stimuli. The most straightforward one here is, again, our muscle movement. Obviously, if I burn my hand, I will move my hand up and I will react to this heat stimulus. Some organisms react very visibly, particularly the high developed animals or protozoa, single-celled animals react to stimuli. There are some organisms that are still alive where you can't see it as much, and this is particularly the plants. You can't see plants move that much. But if you observe a sunflower throughout the day, it will turn towards the sun. So you can, in time lapse particularly, you can record this movement. So some movement to some degree, and some response to some stimuli to some degree within the organism. This must not necessarily be only movement. It can also be a response to a stimulus like the temperature, or a stimulus like environmental conditions with regard to gases. So if there is some response of an organism, then this is one of the criteria for life. Then growth, development, and reproduction. So all organisms that are considered live have to reproduce and develop. And particularly in higher developed organisms, you have this early developmental stages where you have the zygote, the fertilized egg, then it cleaves, the early cleavage stages, so you have the cells, the individual cells that are forming. As this develops more, you then have your embryo that is forming, that then develops to the adult organism. And this development is, again, very dominant or prominent in higher developed organisms, but might not be so prominent in single-celled organisms, although they do reproduce and they do develop to some degree. And this is, for example, you see this in root cells. When they first form, they are much smaller, and then as they mature, they elongate and they get much longer, and you will get to see this in the lab. So growth, development, and reproduction is another criterion for living organisms. Another one here is energy utilization. Energy in order to maintain homeostasis in the body. This energy is needed in order to repair, to keep body temperature up, to reproduce, and all these basic functions. And depending on what kind of organism it is, either organisms can take that up through ingesting energy-rich food sources such as meat or grass, plant material, or in case of plants, of photosynthetic active plants, they can utilize the energy in sunlight and produce energy-rich organic bonds that they can utilize in order to grow. So energy utilization is another one. Homeostasis, to maintain your interior homeostasis is very important for living organisms, and I can give you probably one of the best examples for this is the penguin, who is a bird and lives in the colder climates, often on the southern hemisphere. Particularly the penguins that live at Antarctica, in the winter time it's minus 40 degrees Celsius down there. These birds have a body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, so they have to maintain this body temperature, although the outside temperature is so much colder. So this is the energy that they utilize in order to maintain this homeostasis. If an organism isn't able to maintain this homeostasis, obviously it's not able to survive. And you can see this if you heat up a metal piece and you put it on the cold surface, then it will lose its heat over time, and it will not be able to maintain this heat like a living organism would do. Obviously there are cold-blooded organisms, but they are still able to maintain homeostasis by either adapting enzymes to colder temperatures, so enzymes that are critically important for their metabolic processes, they can work at colder temperatures, or they can utilize energy, heat energy from the environment, such as the sun or the water, in order to drive their metabolic processes. So for that reason, they are able to maintain their homeostasis. And finally, evolutionary adaptation. And this is when organisms over time adapt to their unique living environments, and structures within those organisms change. And one good example here is how the forelimbs change in mammals, or have changed over time in mammals. Here you can see the hand bones in humans, in cats, in bats, in porpoises, and in horses, who all live in different environments and are adapted to different living styles. For example, bats, flying bats, had their digits formed in order to form wings and to fly. Cats have these paws. We have our digits that have made us so handy, grabbing, holding on to things. Porpoises live in the water, need to swim, so they have developed front flippers. And horses have lived in open savannas and need to be able to run and gallop over those savannas and have developed their hooves. So these are adaptations, and living organisms do adapt, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about evolution and Darwin. This concludes the first lecture and the material for the first lecture. And as I said, if you can't see the figures very well here in this lecture, you can pull them up on